I formally buried my husband at noon. By 3 o'clock that same afternoon, I was standing in my black morning dress, tightly gripping the small hands of my 5-year-old twin boys, while my own mother shoved a crumpled $20 bill against my chest. She coldly ordered me to immediately get out of her highly exclusive country club VIP lounge, because I was now nothing more than a widowed charity case who was entirely ruining the wealthy aesthetic. My multi-millionaire parents completely flatly refused to loan me the basic capital required to explicitly stop my modest family home from being actively foreclosed on the very next morning. They stood there in their custom-tailored designer suits and expensive jewelry, watching me walk out into the freezing Georgia rain with nothing but the wet clothes on our backs. They arrogantly thought they had permanently broken me. They expected me to collapse. They had no idea that 5 years later, they would be forced to sit in a crowded civic ballroom and watch me give away $99 million to the working-class heroes who had actually saved us, while their own corrupt real estate empire crumbled into irreversible ruin. My wife formally said how I systematically executed their corporate destruction. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own table after your entitled family deliberately denied you a seat. The pristine glass doors of the Oak Ridge Country Clubs open, immediately hitting me with a blast of warm, expensive vanilla-scented air that felt foreign against my freezing, damp skin. My dark morning dress clung to me, soaked with the cold afternoon drizzle and the sheer, suffocating weight of grief. In my left hand I tightly held Malik, in my right hand I held Miles. My two 5-year-old boys were silent. Their small, exhausted faces, stained with tears they did not fully, logically understand yet. We had just watched a wooden casket lower their brilliant father, Jamal, into the cold Georgia clay 3 agonizing hours ago. I did not belong in this exclusive, wealthy place with its crystal chandeliers and pristine, imported marble floors. I never did, but sheer, financial desperation forces you to walk into hostile rooms you would otherwise avoid. Jamal's sudden illness had been a rapid, merciless thief. The exorbitant medical bills from his intensive care unit stay had drained our modest savings within a few short weeks, explicitly bleeding our small bank accounts dry. The local bank had formally sent the final legal foreclosure notice just 3 days ago. If I did not produce the past due amount by tomorrow morning, my young boys and I would be permanently locked out of the only safe home they had ever known. I entirely explicitly spotted her absolutely immediately completely across the large room. My mother, Valerie, explicitly stood near the center of the exclusive VIP lounge. She wore an immaculate, pristine cream-colored designer pantsuit, a stark, deliberate contrast to the grief I formerly carried into her pristine environment. She was lightly laughing softly, holding an expensive crystal flute of imported champagne, absorbed in a shallow conversation with 2 wealthy corporate men wearing expensive golf attire. I walked toward her, my cheap black heels making a dull thud against the polished, expensive marble floor. The shallow corporate chatter inside the large room began to die down as wealthy guests noticed us. A grieving woman dragging 2 young, fatherless children into an expensive Saturday afternoon mixer was not the curated, exclusive aesthetic Oak Ridge aimed for. "Mom," I quietly said, my voice raspy from crying earlier that agonizing day. Valerie quickly turned. The performed, artificial smile instantly dropped from her contoured face the very second she saw me. She explicitly did not reach out to hug me. She explicitly did not look down at her 2 grieving grandsons, who were clutching tightly at my cold legs, desperately seeking any kind of warmth or comfort. Instead, her cold eyes darted nervously to the wealthy explicit investors standing explicitly beside her, calculating the severe social damage of my very explicit physical explicitly presence. "Kendra," she explicitly hissed, grabbing my left elbow, pulling me quickly away from the center of the explicitly room toward a quiet alcove near the kitchen doors. "What are you doing here? You are making a spectacle of yourself." I need your help, I pleaded, swallowing every single ounce of pride I still had left. The hospital bills took everything we had, Mom. The bank is foreclosing on our modest house tomorrow morning. I just need a temporary financial loan. I will explicitly pay back every single cent. Please, for Malik and Miles. They just lost their father today. They cannot afford to lose their only home tomorrow. Valerie looked at me, her contoured expression hardening into something cold, cruel, and familiar. She reached into her expensive designer handbag. I felt a brief, desperate surge of naive hope. Maybe just this specific once, the severity of the tragic situation would explicitly break through her superficial, hollow shell. Maybe she would finally be a real mother. Instead, she pulled out a cheap, crumpled $20 bill. She explicitly pressed it against my chest. Take this for cheap gas and explicitly leave, she stated. Explicitly, her voice explicitly dropping explicitly to a harsh explicitly whisper. This expensive lounge is explicitly for explicitly family and explicitly level investors. Kendra, it is not for pathetic widowed charity cases. You are ruining the expensive explicitly atmosphere. I stared at the green paper in her hand, the insult knocking the breath out of my lungs. You are turning us away on the day Jamal died? I asked, the reality struggling to process in my exhausted brain. Before Valerie could respond, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I turned to see my father, Calvin. He wore his custom-tailored suit, smelling of expensive cigars and absolute authority. As the CEO of a major logistics firm, Calvin ran his family the same way he ran his business, with ruthless efficiency and zero tolerance for what he considered liabilities. I was his biggest liability. Stop harassing your mother, Calvin said, stepping between us. His voice was loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. He looked down at Malik and Miles. Malik let out a small whimper, burying his face in my dress, terrified by the sheer coldness radiating from his grandfather. Calvin simply scoffed at the display of emotion. We warned you, Kendra, he continued, his words cutting through the air like a knife. We told you exactly what would happen when you dropped out of Spelman to marry that community organizer. You had a clear path to corporate law, you had a future that fit this family, but you chose to throw it away for a life of playing in the dirt with those rescue horses you and Jamal loved so much. I tightened my grip on my son's hands. Jamal spent his life helping people. I fired back, finding a spark of anger beneath the crushing grief. He built that equine therapy program from nothing. He gave back to the community. He was a good man who left you bankrupt and begging for handouts at my country club. Calvin retorted without missing a beat. You made your bed when you chose his world over ours. We are not financing your mistakes. You wanted to be independent so badly. Figure it out yourself. He was rewriting history, as he always did. I had not dropped out of Spelman out of rebellion. I left because they threatened to cut my tuition, the moment I refused to date the son of his biggest investor, choosing Jamal instead. They had systematically isolated me for years, punishing me for valuing purpose over prestige. And now they were using my husband's tragic death as an opportunity to mock the life we built. I looked at my mother. She had turned her back to me, signaling to a waiter for a refill on her champagne, completely indifferent to the fact that her daughter and grandsons were about to be homeless. I looked at my father, whose jaw was set in that familiar, unyielding line of absolute arrogance. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my tears. I let the $20 bill fall from my chest, watching it flutter onto the pristine marble floor. I did not say another word. I squeezed my boys' hands gently. Come on, babies, I whispered. We are leaving. I turned my back on the Atlanta Oak Ridge Country Club, walking out through those heavy glass doors and back into the unforgiving gray afternoon. The rain had picked up, cold and biting, soaking through my thin black dress before we even reached my beat-up sedan in the far corner of the parking lot. I strapped the boys into their car seats, promising them everything would be all right. Even though I had absolutely no idea how I was going to keep that promise, I slid into the driver's seat, wiping the rain and stray tears from my face. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing through impossible options. Suddenly, my phone chimed from inside my purse. I pulled it out, the screen illuminating the dark interior of the car. It was an automated message, marked urgent from my mortgage lender. I opened the email, my eyes scanning the harsh corporate text. It was not a standard foreclosure notice. The message stated that my debt had not simply been processed for bank repossession. Instead, the deed and the outstanding mortgage had been bought out entirely by a private commercial developer. The new owner was executing an immediate order to vacate. My breath caught in my throat as I read the name of the private development firm listed at the bottom of the email. Vanguard Holdings. It was a name I recognized instantly. A name that belonged to the man who was currently sitting inside that country club, laughing and drinking with my parents. The nightmare was not just beginning, it was being orchestrated. A sharp, mocking laugh cut through the heavy air of the country club parking lot. I looked up through the rain-streaked window. My older sister, Chloe, was strutting under a large umbrella held by a valet. She was clinging to the arm of her husband, Todd. Todd was a wealthy real estate developer who had made a highly lucrative career out of gentrifying neighborhood, exactly like the one Jamal and I had dedicated our lives to protecting. Chloe stopped a few feet away from my car, reaching up to adjust a massive diamond pendant resting against her collarbone. "Did you get the email, Kendra?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "I told Todd to make sure the bank sent it before you left. We wanted to be completely transparent with you." Todd smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "I bought your debt, Kendra," Todd said smoothly, stepping closer to the car. "Your father and I had a long talk about your situation. We decided it was time you learned how the real world actually works. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my new property." My lungs felt like they were filled with lead. "You bought the debt on my house just to evict me?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rising fury. "Jamal is barely in the ground, my boys just lost their father." Chloe waved her hand dismissively. "Jamal made his choices, Kendra, and so did you. You were supposed to join Dad's firm as corporate counsel. Look where your choices got you." I rolled up the window, shutting out their toxic voices. I threw the car into reverse and sped out of the parking lot. The drive back to our neighborhood was a blur of slamming windshield wipers and blinding headlights. My mind raced trying to formulate a survival plan. I had 24 hours to pack 10 years of a life built with Jamal. I needed to figure out how to stretch the meager remaining balance in my checking account to cover a cheap motel. I pulled onto our street, the familiar oak trees offering a brief illusion of comfort. But as my headlights swept across the front of our modest single-story house, the illusion shattered instantly. A massive white commercial moving truck was parked aggressively across my driveway. 3 men in dark raincoats were standing on my front porch. They were actively drilling into the front door. I slammed the car into park, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I told the boys to stay put and lock the doors. I stepped out into the torrential rain, sprinting up the front walkway. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "This is my house, I have 24 hours. One of the men turned around, holding a heavy-duty power drill in one hand and a brand-new brass deadbolt in the other. "Not anymore, lady," he said callously. "Management gave the order 30 minutes ago. The locks are already changed. You are officially trespassing." I stared at the shiny new metal hardware securing my front door. Todd did not give me 24 hours. He gave me exactly the amount of time it took to drive home. Behind the lead guard, the front door swung open. 2 other men emerged from my hallway. They were not carrying moving boxes. They were dragging heavy-duty, black trash bags across the hardwood floors Jamal and I had installed ourselves. One of the men heaved his bag over the porch railing. It landed with a sickening crunch on the saturated lawn. "That is my husband's property," I shouted. The guard pulled a folded document from his waterproof pocket. Todd expedited an emergency writ of possession, claiming the property was abandoned and hazardous. "The judge signed it an hour ago. You have no rights here anymore. Move your vehicle off the driveway." or I am calling the police and having you arrested for criminal trespassing. If I got arrested tonight, my boys would go into the system. Todd and Chloe would make sure of it. I could not fight this battle on the front porch in the mud. I turned away, walking down the steps. I ripped open the top of the black trash bag they just threw over the railing. Inside, jumbled together like garbage, were Jamal's framed community service awards and the boys' favorite stuffed animals, now soaked in dirty rainwater. I grabbed the stuffed animals and marched back to my car. I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the door. The boys were shivering. I pulled out my phone and dialed Sarah, my college roommate at Spelman. "Sarah, I am so sorry to call you like this," I rushed out. "Jamal's funeral was today, and my parents let Todd buy my house. We are locked out in the rain right now. Can we please just crash on your living room floor tonight?" There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. "Kendra, I saw Chloe's post," Sarah finally said, her tone dripping with uncomfortable pity. "I know grief makes people do crazy things, but you cannot go around harassing your family for money and making up these wild stories about Todd evicting you." "What post?" "Chloe posted an update an hour ago. She said you had a complete mental break at the country club. She said you tried to extort Todd for $1 million and threatened to ruin his business if he did not pay up. She warned everyone not to enable you, so you would seek professional psychiatric help." The air left my lungs. Chloe did not just take my home, she took my entire support network. She had weaponized her massive social media following to preemptively brand me as a grieving, unstable extortionist. "I cannot help you, Kendra," Sarah said. The line went dead. I dropped the phone onto my lap. I was utterly isolated. My wealthy parents had thrown me away. My sister had orchestrated a smear campaign to ensure no one would catch me when I fell. I had $20 to my name, a tank of gas, and 2 children who had not eaten since breakfast. Suddenly, a sound shattered the quiet interior of the car. Malik started coughing. It was not a small cough. It was a deep, wet rattling sound that shook his entire little body. He was shivering violently in his damp suit jacket. The cold had already settled deep into his chest. Panic, raw and absolute, overrode my pride. I could not let my boys sleep in this freezing car. I picked up my phone again. I opened my contacts and dialed the one number I swore I would never call unless it was a matter of life and death. When Jamal and I got married, his parents, Isaiah and Brenda, were proud, hard-working people who lived paycheck to paycheck in a tiny, cramped house in South Atlanta. Jamal had spent his life trying to lift them out of poverty. He begged me never to burden them with our financial problems. But Jamal was gone, and his sons were freezing. The phone rang twice before Brenda answered. "Brenda, it is Kendra," I sobbed, the dam finally breaking. "We are locked out. Todd took the house. They threw our things in the mud, and the boys are so cold. Malik is coughing, and I have nowhere to go. I am so sorry." I waited for her to ask questions about Chloe's post or why my millionaire father was not helping me. The hesitation never came. "Where are you, daughter?" Brenda asked, her voice suddenly transforming from a grieving mother into steel. "We are in the driveway. The guards are telling us to move. Put your hazard lights on," Brenda commanded. "Do not move an inch. We are on our way." 30 agonizing minutes later, headlights cut through the dark, rainy street. It was not a police cruiser or a sleek luxury SUV, it was a rusted 10-year-old pickup truck. The engine whined loudly as it pulled aggressively into the driveway, entirely blocking the security guard's path. The doors of the truck flew open. Isaiah and Brenda stepped out directly into the deep, freezing mud. Isaiah's heavy work boots hit the wet pavement with a solid thud. He walked straight up to the lead security guard, his broad shoulders squared. The guard raised a hand to issue a warning, but Isaiah swatted his arm away with the calloused hand of a man who spent 40 years walking miles as a postal worker, in every weather condition imaginable. "Do not touch me," Isaiah barked, his voice carrying a dangerous low rumble. "And do not touch my son's things." Brenda marched straight to my car, pulling the back door open. She stripped off her thick wool winter coat. ignoring the freezing rain, and wrapped it around Malik and Miles, bundling them tightly against her chest. "Grandma is here," she whispered fiercely. I watched through the rain-streaked window as Isaiah dropped to his knees in the ruined grass. He completely ignored the deep mud, reaching into the torn plastic bags and carefully pulling out Jamal's framed community service awards and the boys' scattered toys, treating every damaged item like a priceless artifact. He dared the guard to say a single word. The man stepped back, lowering his flashlight. We piled into the cramped cab of the truck and drove deeper into the working-class streets of South Atlanta. Isaiah and Brenda lived in a small, fading two-bedroom brick house that desperately needed a new roof. Yet, the moment we walked through their front door, the contrast was staggering. The house smelled like cinnamon and clean linen. Brenda immediately marched me into the tiny bathroom, handing me thick, warm towels. I cried for the second time that night, not from despair, but from the overwhelming realization of what true family actually meant. It is not about bloodlines or trust funds. It is about who steps into the mud when you are drowning. I woke up the next morning disoriented. The rich, comforting smell of butter and sizzling bacon filled the small house. I heard the television playing softly in the living room, accompanied by the miraculous sound of Malik and Miles giggling. I pushed myself out of bed and walked down the narrow hallway. Brenda was standing at the stove. I looked toward the kitchen table, expecting to see Isaiah drinking his morning coffee. Instead, the table was completely covered in a chaotic mountain of paperwork. Isaiah was hunched over stacks of printed documents, municipal zoning maps, and public property records. As a former postal worker, who walked every street in this city for 4 decades, Isaiah knew exactly how the municipal machine operated. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion, burning with a sharp, dangerous intensity. "I spent the entire night digging into Todd's shell companies," Isaiah said, his voice rough. "I wanted to know how a real estate developer managed to expedite an emergency writ of possession so fast on a Saturday. I wanted to know why he targeted your specific street." "Chloe said it was to teach me a lesson," I replied, my voice tight. Isaiah shook his head slowly. He pulled a thick, heavily redacted corporate document from the center of the pile and slid it across the table. "Your father and your brother-in-law are liars, Kendra," Isaiah said, looking me dead in the eye. "Todd did not buy your debt just to be cruel, he bought your house. Because the city council just quietly approved a massive multi-million-dollar infrastructure bill. They are building a new commercial highway, and the main off-ramp is planned to go right through your old living room." I stared at the redacted municipal documents. The blueprints showed the concrete off-ramp cutting through our neighborhood. Todd did not buy my foreclosed mortgage because he wanted to punish me. He bought it because he had inside information from the city council. The government was preparing to buy out our street under eminent domain for millions of dollars. Todd swooped in, used my husband's sudden death to trigger an immediate default, and stole the property for pennies so he could collect the government payout. And my father, Calvin, had funded the transaction. My own father had handed his son-in-law the capital to legally steal my home while I was picking out a casket. My first instinct was to fight. I wanted to march into the courthouse, expose the insider trading, and drag Todd and my father in front of a judge. But Isaiah gently placed his hand over mine. He knew that Calvin had a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. If a penniless, grieving widow tried to sue them, they would bury me in legal fees and probably try to take custody of Malik and Miles. I had to let the house go. I wiped my face, pushing the anger down deep into my chest where it could fuel me. I told Isaiah and Brenda that I was done with my biological family. But I was not just going to survive. I was going to build the exact empire Jamal and I had spent our late nights dreaming about. I opened my laptop and pulled up a commercial real estate listing. It was a massive, foreclosed plot of land in the valley sitting miles outside the city limits. Right now it was nothing but barren dirt and a collapsing barn. But to me it was the perfect location for Jamal's haven, a premier equine youth therapy ranch. The only way the bank will release that land to me is if I can produce a massive cash down payment by the end of the week, I said, closing the laptop. I will apply for high-interest loans. I will go to shadow lenders. I will do whatever it takes. Brenda stood up from the stove. She placed her hands over my laptop. You are not going to any predatory lenders. Isaiah walked down the hallway to their bedroom. He returned holding a small weathered leather folder. He pulled out a single rectangular slip of paper and slid it across the table. I looked down. It was a certified cashier's check. The name was left blank, but the number written on the right side made my lungs seize. It was an astronomical sum. Where did you get this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It is Isaiah's entire postal worker pension, Brenda said softly. It is my retired public school teacher savings. It is the life insurance policy we cashed out early. It is our emergency fund. They had liquidated their entire existence, their safety net, their absolute future, and placed it on the kitchen table in front of me. No, I cried, shaking my head and pushing the check back. I cannot take your future. If this ranch fails, you will have nothing. Isaiah slid the check right back to me. His face was set with fierce, unshakable conviction. Jamal believed in you, and we believe in you, Kendra. You think we care about a savings account when our family needs a foundation. Take it. I picked up the check, my fingers trembling. I promised them I would not fail. Build the dream. Kendra, Isaiah said, his expression hardening into absolute seriousness. But listen to me carefully. Your father and Todd hunt for sport. If they find out you bought that land, they will find a way to bleed you dry, or steal it out from under you again. You take this check, you go to a lawyer, and you put every single inch of that property under a blind, anonymous limited liability company. The very next morning I walked into a corporate attorney's office in downtown Atlanta and legally ceased to exist. I signed the paperwork to create Jamal's Haven LLC, establishing a complex corporate structure with a registered agent in Delaware. I buried my identity so deep beneath layers of legal protection that not even a highly paid private investigator could trace the dirt road of this ranch back to me. 5 years is a lifetime when you measure it in sweat, deep calluses, and dark pre-dawn alarms. My alarm rang at 4 o'clock every single morning. The valley was pitch black and freezing when I stepped out of the modest modular home I had initially placed on the rural property. The cold wind whipped down from the heavy foothills, biting through my thick canvas jacket. As I walked toward the collapsing barn, we slowly rebuilt the structure board by heavy board. There was no glamour in this life, there was only grit, heavy dirt, and relentless, agonizing physical labor. I spent my quiet mornings mucking out heavy stalls, shoveling wet manure into wheelbarrows until the tight muscles in my lower back screamed in protest. My soft hands, once manicured for exclusive country club dinners, became rough, cracked, and permanently stained with heavy earth and iodine. Isaiah was right beside me every single morning. The retired postal worker traded his neat blue uniform for heavy denim overalls, hammering nails, repairing broken heavy wooden fences, and fixing broken water lines directly in the freezing, heavy rain. Brenda took over all the complex logistics, managing the heavy accounting, ordering exact feed, and ensuring Malik and Miles were fed, educated, and loved while I worked myself directly to the bone. Our first arrivals were traumatized rescue horses. They came directly to us battered, starved, and terrified of human contact. They were broken creatures casually discarded by arrogant people who deemed them useless. I looked directly into their panicked, wide eyes and saw my own reflection. We slowly healed each other in the quiet hours of the deep morning. I sat in the heavy dirt of the round pen for silent hours, letting them slowly learn to trust my quiet presence, teaching them that they were safe in this isolated valley. Then came the traumatized children. Word spread through the county about the new, successful equine facility in the Deep Valley. We started taking in traumatized youth directly from the foster care system, angry teenagers who had been bounced from broken home to broken home. Kids who had suffered the kind of profound, heavy trauma that traditional talk therapy could not touch. I watched angry, defensive teenagers walk into our pastures with their tight fists clenched and their jaws tight. I watched those same teenagers press their wet faces into the necks of our rescue horses and sob until their knees gave out. There is a profound, unspoken language between a broken young child and a broken large horse. They recognize the raw survival-heavy instinct in each other. I took the meticulously recorded data of these breakthroughs to the powerful state capitol. I sat across from the skeptical government health officials in a sterile, corporate boardroom. They saw an unknown anonymous LLC represented by a quiet woman with dirt under her calloused fingernails. I did not give them a single chance to dismiss me. I handed them binders of empirical data, complex psychological evaluations, and detailed operational metrics, proving that Jamal's Haven was reducing recidivism rates and significantly improving mental health outcomes faster than any facility in the state. I walked out of that specific sterile boardroom with a multi-million-dollar 5-year state contract. The heavy funding changed everything, but I maintained the impenetrable secrecy of Jamal's Haven LLC. The new money allowed us to hire specialized trauma therapists, massively expand our green pastures, and heavy build a state-of-the-art covered riding arena. But I blocked every single minor attempt my toxic biological family made to locate me. I heavy changed my personal phone number. I closed my old bank accounts. I set up secure, untraceable post office boxes for any unavoidable personal mail. Occasionally, news from my old life filtered through the cracks. Sarah, my former college roommate, attempts to reach out Federal Explicit through an old email address I now Federal Explicit use exclusively for junk mail. She forwarded a digital link to a Federal Explicit article from Atlanta Luxury Living magazine. The glossy cover featured Chloe and Todd standing proudly in front of their sprawling 20,000 square foot mega mansion. The headline Federal Explicit praised Todd as a visionary real estate developer for who recently closed a government infrastructure buyout. I stared coldly at the glossy digital photo of my entitled sister draped explicit in expensive diamonds, standing over the wreckage of my previous living room. The grapevine whispered that Chloe frequently told all her society-wealthy friends that I had suffered a mental breakdown, lost custody of my boys, and was living pathetically in a cheap trailer park somewhere too explicit ashamed to Federal Explicit show my ruined face. They were blissfully charitable foundation. The exact private security contractors Jamal had hired dropped their weapons and backed slowly away. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The valley was perfectly still. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of rescue horses chewing hay. I was walking toward the main office, with a clipboard of feed inventory, when a high-pitched mechanical whine shattered the silence. I stopped in my tracks, shielding my eyes against the bright sun. Hovering 50 feet above the main riding arena was a sleek black commercial-grade drone. Its camera lens was swiveling, meticulously recording the layout of the property, the new barns, and the sprawling pastures. It hovered for 10 agonizing seconds, violating the privacy of my sanctuary, before banking sharply and speeding off toward the access road. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Developers do not fly commercial drones over private agricultural land unless they are mapping it. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table watching the access road until the sun came up. The next morning, the mail carrier drove his truck all the way up to the main office instead of leaving the delivery at the highway mailbox. He handed me a thick envelope requiring a certified signature. The return address belonged to the City Zoning and Planning Commission. My hands were numb as I carried the envelope to my desk. Inside was a formal, legally binding notification of a municipal land reassessment. A massive corporate development conglomerate had petitioned the city to seize the entire valley through the laws of eminent domain. They were claiming the land was necessary for a multi-use commercial reservoir and recreational complex that would benefit the greater county. I scanned down to the bottom of the petition to find the name of the corporate developer who had filed the injunction. Vanguard Holdings, Todd. He was doing it again. 5 years after he had stolen my family home through an insider infrastructure deal, he had set his sights on my valley. He had absolutely no idea that the anonymous Jamal's Haven LLC belonged to the penniless widow he had thrown into the mud. To Todd, this was just another massive lucrative land grab. The city council was holding an open public hearing on the eminent domain petition that Friday evening. If the council approved Todd's commercial proposal, the state would force Jamal's Haven LLC to sell the land at a fraction of its true value, and the bulldozers would destroy everything we had built. Isaiah stood in the doorway of my office, having read the letter over my shoulder. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles jumped in his cheek. "We fight," Isaiah said, his voice a dangerous rumble. "We do not run this time, Kendra. We go down to that Sidaitsul meeting and we expose every single dirty deal he has ever made." "No," I replied, a cold, razor-sharp calm washing over me. "We do not just expose him, Isaiah, we annihilate him." I spent the next 3 days locked in my office, utilizing the data architecture I had built for the state health department. I cross-referenced Vanguard Holdings' public tax records with the private municipal zoning changes over the last 5 years. I followed the money. Todd was not just lucky. He was bribing 3 key city council members through offshore shell accounts to approve infrastructure projects exactly where he had recently purchased cheap, foreclosed land. My father, Calvin, was actively funding the initial acquisitions and taking a 40% cut of the massive government payouts. They were running a multi-million-dollar criminal syndicate disguised as real estate development. Friday evening arrived. The city council chambers were packed with local reporters, wealthy developers, and concerned citizens. I sat in the very back row of the auditorium, wearing a sharp, tailored executive suit. I blended into the shadows, a ghost waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Todd took the podium at the front of the room, wearing an immaculate custom suit. He confidently presented his proposal for the Valley Reservoir, using glossy digital renderings and projecting an aura of benevolent corporate responsibility. Chloe sat in the front row, wearing her diamonds, beaming with pride at her husband. My father sat beside her, nodding in arrogant approval. "This reservoir will provide essential infrastructure and recreational value to the county," Todd concluded, adjusting his expensive tie. "The current owner of the land, an absentee LLC, has unfortunately allowed the property to stagnate. Eminent domain is the only logical path forward for the greater good of this community." The council members, the very men Todd was secretly bribing, nodded in unison. The mayor asked if there were any public comments before they moved to a final vote. I stood up from the back row, the sound of my heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor echoed through the silent chambers. "I have a comment, Mr. Mayor," I said, my voice projecting with icy, undeniable authority. Chloe turned around first, her jaw dropped, her face draining of all color as she recognized me. Todd gripped the edges of the podium, his confident smirk instantly evaporating. My father stared at me, as if he had just seen an apparition. I walked straight down the center aisle, holding a thick, leather-bound dossier. "My name is Kendra," I announced to the crowded room. "And I am the sole owner, founder, and CEO of Jamal's Haven LLC. My land is not an absentee holding. It is the premier, state-funded equine trauma therapy sanctuary in the region, generating higher mental health recovery rates than any facility in your district." I stopped directly in front of the council bench, standing just a few feet away from a paralyzed Todd. "Furthermore," I continued, opening the dossier, "Vanguard Holdings has absolutely no interest in building a recreational reservoir. Todd intends to flip the land to the state for a multi-million-dollar profit, exactly like he did 5 years ago when he utilized insider information to purchase my foreclosed home, mere days before this council approved a commercial highway through the property." The room erupted into shocked murmurs. The press corps in the front row scrambled for their recorders. "This is slander," Todd shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Remove her. She is a delusional, bitter woman with a history of mental instability. I ignored his outburst and handed the dossier directly to the city clerk. In that file, I stated coldly, "You will find incontrovertible forensic proof that Todd and his primary financier, Calvin, have funneled over $12 million in illegal bribes through offshore accounts directly to 3 members of this very city council to secure eminent domain approvals." The 3 corrupt council members turned ash white. The mayor slammed his gavel, desperately trying to maintain order as the chamber descended into absolute chaos. "I have already forwarded the digital footprint of these transactions to the FBI's white-collar crime division," I added smoothly, turning to look directly at my father and Todd. "I believe they are currently executing search warrants at your corporate headquarters as we speak." Todd collapsed backward, stumbling into his chair. Chloe buried her face in her hands. My father sat frozen in pure, unadulterated terror. Realize that the penniless daughter he had discarded in the rain had just systematically orchestrated the total destruction of his empire. The city council unanimously rejected the eminent domain petition that night, in a frantic bid to distance themselves from the scandal. But the federal indictments came down a week later. Todd and Calvin were arrested for massive wire fraud, conspiracy, and bribery. Their assets were frozen, their businesses liquidated, and they were both sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The process of building Jamal's Haven from the ground up was not merely a physical reconstruction of a derelict property. It was a profound psychological metamorphosis. Every morning when I woke up before dawn, the sharp, biting cold of the valley wind served as a stark reminder of the freezing rain my boys and I had endured the day we were locked out. That memory was no longer a source of paralyzing trauma. It had crystallized into a dark, unyielding engine of absolute motivation. I channeled every ounce of grief, every shred of anger at the betrayal by my own flesh and blood, into the physical labor of restoring the land. My parents had spent their entire lives worshipping the shallow aesthetic of immense wealth. They valued the superficial veneer of country club memberships, imported designer suits, and the quiet, arrogant power of manipulating local real estate markets. They believed that poverty was a moral failing and that compassion was an unforgivable corporate liability. By throwing me out, they thought they were cutting off a weak branch to preserve the strength of their toxic tree. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the basic architecture of power. Real power is not inherited in a VIP lounge, it is forged in the absolute darkest, most desperate moments of human survival. The first year was brutal. We operated on a shoestring budget, relying entirely on Isaiah's postal pension and Brenda's teacher savings. I learned how to stretch a dollar further than my father ever had to in his entire corporate career. I haggled with local feed suppliers, learned how to weld broken steel gates myself, and spent countless hours studying state agricultural grants at the public library. We did not have the luxury of failure. Every time the heavy physical exhaustion threatened to pull me under, I would look out over the sprawling pastures and see Malik and Miles laughing as they chased the rescue dogs through the tall grass. Their unburdened joy was the only return on investment I required. As the sanctuary slowly expanded, so did my understanding of the complex bureaucratic systems that governed our lives. I began meticulously studying the intersection of state healthcare funding, foster care systemic deficiencies, and the proven psychological efficacy of equine trauma therapy. I did not just want to run a small charity. I wanted to build a bulletproof, state-funded institution that no corrupt developer or hostile city council could ever touch. I pored over dense legal treatises and municipal zoning codes, educating myself on the very weapons my father and Todd had used to steal my home. I learned how corporate conglomerates utilized anonymous shell companies to hide toxic assets and launder illegal campaign contributions. When the state health officials first visited Jamal's Haven to assess our eligibility for federal grant funding, they were expecting a disorganized, bleeding heart charity operation. Instead, I presented them with a highly sophisticated, data-driven operational model. I provided detailed, empirical psychological evaluations, proving that our specific equine intervention program significantly reduced the long-term state costs associated with high-risk youth recidivism. I spoke their language. I demonstrated a return on investment that was impossible for the bureaucratic machine to ignore. The resulting multi-million-dollar state contract was the turning point. But it also required me to elevate the secrecy of Jamal's Haven LLC. I knew that if my father or Todd discovered my sudden financial success, they would relentlessly hunt for a vulnerability. They would attempt to leverage their political connections to freeze my state funding, or they would try to initiate a hostile corporate takeover of the sanctuary simply out of malicious spite. I employed a top-tier cybersecurity firm to scrub my digital footprint. I established a series of nested corporate entities in Delaware and Wyoming, ensuring that the true ownership of the valley remained shielded behind layers of impenetrable legal anonymity. This deep corporate isolation proved to be my ultimate weapon when Todd's drone finally appeared over the valley. When I received the eminent domain petition, I did not panic. I did not feel the sudden, crushing despair that had paralyzed me in my beat-up sedan 5 years ago. I felt the cold, precise execution of a perfectly laid trap finally snapping shut. My forensic investigation into Vanguard Holdings was a masterclass in digital excavation. Utilizing the highly secured data architecture I had initially developed to process sensitive state health records, I began cross-referencing Todd's public tax filings with the private, unlisted zoning changes approved by the local city council over the last half-decade. The pattern of corruption was glaringly obvious once you knew exactly where to look. Todd was not a brilliant real estate developer. He was a highly connected corporate parasite. He systematically targeted economically vulnerable neighborhoods that were secretly slated for major municipal infrastructure upgrades. He would aggressively buy up distressed properties and foreclosed mortgages for pennies on the dollar, holding the land just long enough for the city to officially announce the new highway or reservoir project. Then, he would eagerly allow the city to seize the land under eminent domain, collecting massive, inflated government payouts. But the real crime was not the land grab itself. It was the mechanism of his insider knowledge. I traced a series of complex, obscured wire transfers from a subsidiary of Calvin's logistics firm, routed through a dummy corporation in the Cayman Islands, and ultimately deposited into the offshore trust accounts of 3 key city council members. My father was the primary financier of the criminal syndicate. He was bribing local government officials to guarantee the approval of the infrastructure projects that artificially inflated Todd's real estate portfolio. They had stolen my home and thrown my children into the rain using the exact same illegal blueprint, and now they were arrogantly trying to use that exact same blueprint to steal my multi-million-dollar sanctuary. I meticulously compiled every single digital signature, every obscured routing number, and every deleted email linking Calvin's logistics firm to the corrupt councilman. I built an impenetrable fortress of federal evidence. I did not just want to stop the eminent domain petition. I wanted to ensure that the entire foundation of their arrogant empire was completely and irreversibly reduced to ash. The sanctuary became a beacon of hope, not just for the children we served, but for every single person who walked through our wooden gates. The therapeutic process was never easy. It required an immense amount of patience, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to seeing the best in those who had experienced the worst. I remember the very first teenager who arrived at Jamal's Haven. His name was Marcus. He was 15 years old, had been in the foster care system since he was a toddler, and carried a thick file detailing a history of behavior and severe emotional detachment. When he first stepped out of the county transport van, his posture was a defensive wall. He expected us to fail him, just like every other institution had. I did not push him, I simply handed him a pitchfork and pointed toward the main stable. For the first 2 weeks, Marcus did nothing but grueling physical labor. He mucked out stalls, hauled bales of hay, and scrubbed the water troughs until his hands blistered. He worked in defiant silence, but I watched him carefully. I noticed how he would occasionally pause to watch our oldest rescue horse, a scarred gelding named Titan, grazing in the far pasture. Titan had been severely abused by a previous owner and was terrified of sudden movements. On the third week, I gave Marcus a simple brush and told him to go stand in the round pen with Titan. I gave him absolutely no further instructions, I just told him to exist in the same space as the broken animal. I watched from the main office window as Marcus slowly walked into the pen. Titan immediately retreated to the far corner, his ears pinned back in absolute fear. Marcus did not try to approach him, he simply sat down in the heavy dirt, crossed his legs, and waited. He sat there for 3 agonizing hours in the hot Georgia sun. Finally, driven by an ingrained herd instinct and an undeniable curiosity, the horse took a single, hesitant step forward. Then another, slowly, agonizingly. Titan closed the distance between them until he was standing over the teenager. The horse lowered his head, inhaling Marcus's scent. Marcus slowly raised his hand, his fingers trembling, and gently rested his palm against the horse's scarred shoulder. Titan let out a long breath and closed his eyes, surrendering to the human contact. I watched Marcus completely break down. He buried his face in the horse's and sobbed with a raw, agonizing intensity that echoed across the quiet valley. It was the sound of a child, finally realizing that he was not completely alone in the world. It was the sound of absolute healing. Marcus was the first, but he was far from the last. We scaled our operations meticulously, expanding our capacity to take in more kids and more horses. The state grants allowed us to hire a full-time staff of licensed trauma therapists, equine specialists, and experienced social workers. But the core philosophy of Jamal's Haven never changed. We believed in the profound, transformative power of unconditional empathy and hard, meaningful work. Isaiah and Brenda became the emotional pillars of the operation. They did not just manage the logistics, they became surrogate grandparents to dozens of lost kids. Brenda would bake trays of cookies sitting on the porch of the guest house and listening patiently as teenagers poured their hearts out to her. Isaiah taught the older boys how to repair the tractors, how to mend fences, and how to take pride in the physical maintenance of the sanctuary. They provided the steady, unwavering love that these kids had been denied their lives. They were the true architects of the healing that took place in that valley. They had sacrificed their entire future, every single penny they had saved, to give me the capital I needed. They never once asked for anything in return. They never once doubted my vision or my capability. They simply gave everything they had, because they believed it was the right thing to do. That is the definition of true wealth. It is not measured in offshore bank accounts or country club memberships. It is measured in the lives you actively change and the immense unconditional love you actively put into the world. When I stood up in that crowded city council chamber and revealed my identity, I was not speaking as the broken, grieving widow they remembered. I was the architect of their destruction. I watched the profound terror slowly dawn on their faces, as they realized that the woman they had deemed a pathetic financial liability had spent the last 5 years quietly mastering the very systems they used to oppress people. I watched my father's unyielding authority shatter in real time. He finally understood that he had not just made a terrible business mistake. He had arrogantly created the monster that was now systematically dismantling his life. The federal response was swift and merciless. The FBI raids on Calvin's corporate headquarters and Todd's massive mansion were broadcast on every major news network. The sheer scale of their public humiliation was absolute. They were not just bankrupt. They were completely destroyed, stripped of their wealth, their social status, and their freedom. As I walked off the stage of the philanthropic gala, having transferred the massive $99 million expansion grant to Isaiah and Brenda's perpetual trust, I felt a profound, incredible sense of closure. The long, agonizing chapter of my toxic family was finally, permanently closed. I had not just survived the freezing rain. I had built an empire strong enough to shelter the people who truly mattered. Chloe, stripped of her diamonds and her mansion, was forced to file for bankruptcy, completely abandoned by the high society friends she had once used to isolate me. Exactly 1 year after they were sentenced, I stood on the grand stage of an exclusive Atlanta philanthropic gala. Jamal's Haven had just been awarded a massive $99 million federal expansion grant to build therapy sanctuaries across the entire country. I looked out into the crowded ballroom, my eyes finding the two people who mattered most. Isaiah and Brenda were sitting at the front table, dressed in elegant formal wear, beaming with absolute pride. 5 years ago, I walked out of a country club with nothing but my children and the clothes on our backs. I said into the microphone, my voice echoing through the silent, captivated room. I survived because two working-class heroes emptied their entire life savings, risking their own survival to give a grieving widow a second chance. Tonight, I am officially transferring the initial $99 million expansion capital into a perpetual trust managed entirely by Isaiah and Brenda. The ballroom erupted in a massive standing ovation. I walked off the stage and embraced my true family. I had not just survived the rain, I had summoned the storm that washed the toxic rot away forever, leaving behind an empire built on absolute, unyielding love.